Welcome everyone to today's meeting of the Police and Crime Committee. Our main item of business this morning is a discussion with invited guests on the Independent Office of Police Conduct. Please make sure that your electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid any interruptions. Can I now ask our clerk, Lauren Harvey, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies for absence have been received from Assemblymember Prince, for whom Assemblymember Boff is attending as a substitute.
Thank you, Assemblymember Boff. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? Thank you. Can we note the completed and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings of the committee? Thank you. We now move on to our main item of business, which is a discussion session with invited guests on the Independent Office of for Police Conduct. So I would like to welcome our guest, Kenny Bowie, Director of Strategy and Policing Oversight from the Mayor's Office of Policing and Crime, formerly or more often known as MOPAC, and Commander John Savell, Head of Professionalism Standards and Recognition of the Metropolitan Police Service. Welcome both. Given the focus of this meeting, this committee first extended an invitation to the Iopc on the 30th of March. On the 26th of May, topic areas for discussion for today were provided to the Iopc, more than complying with their own request for notice and in line with standard operating timescales for this committee. Unfortunately, the Iopc subsequently decided to withdraw from this meeting, and at a last gasp plea to the Director General, Michael Lockwood, it was unsuccessful. And though they have now agreed to attend a future meeting, I speak for the committee when I express our disappointment that they're not willing to join us today. Thank you, colleagues. The Iopc remains welcome to attend today's meeting, and there is a seat for them. There are important issues for us to discuss, and so I've ensured that there is a place for them to the committee room should any Iopc representative wish to join us at any point. Okay, gentlemen, I'll start the questioning. So I'm going to ask you both, but if I come to the Commander first, how would you rate the effectiveness of investigations undertaken by the Iopc?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for inviting me. I hope I'll be able to answer your questions as fully as I possibly can. If I can't and there's additional information that you need, then I will, of course, go away, come back and provide that for you at a later date. I've tried to get as much background information and facts and figures as I can so that we have as fulsome a meeting as necessary. I think the question is asking one of my opinion of the efficacy of the Iopc investigations. I think they are varied. But in fairness, I think if you ask the same question of a police investigation, the answer would be it is varied. So the type of investigation can be incredibly complex or very straightforward, and the skills and capability and capacity of the Iopc is obviously much less than it is of the police, and so very often they will have to ask for our assistance. Okay,
which isn't always helpful given that they're looking at specific officers. Kenny Bowie, what's your view?
Sorry, thank you, Chair. So I think my view would very much chime with Commander Savell's on that. I would also say that I think there is a problem of capacity within the Iopc, whilst I do think any and every organisation has an obligation to look at how it can improve itself first and foremost, become more efficient, become more effective. If we look at what has happened over the last few years in terms of the government funding for police forces overall, which has been obviously very welcome and has led to a large uplift in the number of serving officers, I don't think we have seen a similar uplift in the funding provided to the Iopc. And obviously with it being a demand-led organisation, you would expect to see an increase in referrals and increase in workload for it. So I think there is a genuine, I think there are two things. I think the effectiveness of the investigations, I would agree, as with any force, as with any organisation, it will be variable. I think there is more than Iopc can do to look at that itself, but I also think there will inevitably just be a question of capacity for it, which will ultimately hinder its ability to do that, probably.
Because I believe in 2019 the BBC reported on figures which were obtained via Freedom of Information request, showed that 2/3 of the 48 gross misconduct cases brought by the Iopc in the 3 years to October 2018 were found not proven at misconduct hearings, and only 5 hearings had resulted in dismissals. That's pretty poor, isn't it?
Well, there are an awful lot of variables in that. I mean, the figures are stark, clearly. I think when you say 48 gross misconduct hearings, that's probably ones where, forgive me, the Iopc have directed that a gross misconduct hearing is carried out. Then there is a difference. You know, forgive me if I'm going to explain too much detail, but they will make an assessment following an investigation and a determination as to whether it is gross misconduct or no case to answer, in simple terms. There are occasions when the appropriate authority, the police, disagree with that, having looked at the facts and the evidence, and suggest that actually they don't think that it's reached that standard. The Iopc will have the final say in that, and they will, on occasions, disagree with our assessment and direct that we hold a gross misconduct hearing. Because there will be a lot more than 48, I would have thought, over a period of time that were gross misconduct hearings that the Iopc were involved in. I would suggest that that will be a national figure, and that's probably 48 cases where they have disagreed with the police force and have directed that there is a gross misconduct hearing.
Yes,
does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, but it's kind of underlying what I'm saying.
Well, it does, because
they're saying they're gross misconduct, and it's not proven. That's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I think, having lived and breathed this world for a little while now, that much of that may very come back down to the regulations and the interpretation of the regulations, because the statutory guidance is the bar or threshold for determining whether or not it is gross misconduct and a hearing should go ahead. Is a sort of a very wordy paragraph, but in effect is that a panel could find, on the balance of probabilities, that gross misconduct is proven. And actually, if you think about that, could is quite a low bar. And whilst it might be semantics, but if that was would find on the balance of probabilities, that's quite a higher bar.
Yeah.
And of course, when you get to an independent panel with a legally qualified independent chair, they are testing the evidence and will almost certainly be, it's quite a higher bar.
Yeah.
So therefore there is a massive difference, and I think that is one of the issues around the regulations which causes us some difficulty, and of course will cause the Iopc some difficulty, because it's very subjective.
Yeah, and it's a shame they're not here to give us reasons for that, or come up with a reason. If I can ask you both, are you content with the time it takes to complete Iopc investigations? I'll start this time with Kenny. I mean, I know what I'm told by serving police officers. What's your view?
My view is that we would always like the investigations to be as quick as possible. A couple of reasons for that. Firstly, actually, if officers in its gross misconduct or and are unrestricted duties are suspended, if the officer is actually going to be found not proven from actually an officer perspective, we would want them out working on the beat as quickly as possible. And equally, if they are going to be found proven and to be dismissed, I would far rather that taxpayer money was not spent on their salary and doing all of that. I also think that there's just a general principle that investigations and justice should be done as quickly as possible, and that should apply to the police as much as it applies to any other citizens. So do I think things have, and the stats would bear out that the investigations have started to get quicker over the last few years? Yes, I think that's true. Do I think that there is more that we would like to see done in that regard for the reasons that I have outlined? Yes, again, I think that would be a fair reflection of our position.
Have you anything to add to that, Commander?
Not particularly. Public trust and confidence and our ability to support officers and run an effective policing service is very much about having officers out there doing the job they need to do. And if they are unable to do that for an extended period of time, it's in no one's best interests, and we would like to see that reduced. And the length of time an IOPC investigation takes will be a considerable factor in getting ourselves to a point where an officer can get some closure, the complainant, the victim, the public understand, and they get to the answers that they would be after as well.
Well, it's closure all round, isn't it, for the victims and the police officers who are waiting for this. I see that in March 22, the Iopc paid compensation to 6 police officers who had faced lengthy investigations between 4 and 7 years. I mean, that is shocking. Have we ever done any work, or has police ever done any work on how much it costs especially the Metropolitan, as we're in London talking about the Met Police? Have you done any work on seeing how much it actually costs the force for officers that are off duty waiting for some sort of verdict?
I'm not aware of any exact figures, but it's well reported what the sort of average cost of a police constable is per year. Somewhere in the region of about £60,000 with training and pension and employment costs. It's quite easy to work out what that overall cost would be if the officer is suspended. It's a bit trickier when they're restricted, because they are still obviously adding value and doing some work, but very often not out engaging with the public and doing the job that most police officers are employed to do.
Well, perhaps if the force thought it was appropriate, they started working out figures on what it cost. There might be pressure on whoever to either get more money into the IOPC to deal with this, or pressure on the IOPC to actually get these situations sorted out quicker, because I suspect it would be an eye-watering figure. If you add that to the compensation that taxpayers are having to pay, quite rightfully, to people that have waited between 4 and 7 years, I suspect that might make people focus their thoughts on that.
If I may, Chair, and clearly I'm not here to defend the IOPC, but one of the issues that would drag that out is whether there is a criminal investigation and prosecution. So it must be borne in mind that they will try and be run in parallel, but if there is a complicated criminal prosecution, in almost all cases the Crown Prosecution Service would be very strong in their objection of a misconduct process running at the same time.
Yep, and we can understand that, which is why it is such a shame the IOPC can put up today, because they could say 10%, 20%, 90% of that is the reason, which would make all of us quite happy, because we'd know the reasoning behind it. When they do eventually turn up, that's certainly something that I'll make sure is a question put out there. So thank you for adding that. That is certainly something to be thought about. I saw Assembly Member Soho. Did you need to come in at this point? Yeah. Can you put your...
Commander, I'm just referring to those 48 cases which you were talking about earlier on. When you said you were directed to prosecute, so does that mean that the IOPC makes a judgment that there is a gross misconduct, and then it directs you, the police who disagree with them, to conduct the case?
Yes, that's correct. So we would then present the evidence, employ independent counsel, but in effect we then present that evidence to a panel on behalf of the IOPC.
Having made a judgment that you don't think there is a case to answer on that scale of misconduct, gross misconduct.
That's correct.
So there's a weakness in the system there.
Yes, although if I may, just for clarity, the regulations changed about 18 to 24 months ago, where the IOPC now have the power to present cases themselves, which I think they are starting to begin to do now, and I think we would all welcome for independence and objectivity where there is that fundamental difference, that the IOPC then will present the case themselves, and the public will see that he's completely independent rather than that slightly uncomfortable situation you've just described.
Yeah. Transparency is a must. Do you think, both of you again, that the IOPC should have a deadline for completion of investigations of misconduct, such as the maximum of 12 months suggested by the Police Federation?
I think having a benchmark to work to would be helpful in terms of measuring performance. 12 months is a very long time.
Yeah.
I think we would all like to see that in 12 weeks rather than 12 months, but we have to be practical, because sometimes if there's a criminal prosecution, we know with all the delays with that will stretch it out far beyond that. And there are some cases which are incredibly complex. For example, if it's a fraud or corruption or possession of indecent images, where there is vast amounts of data to wade through, it does take quite a long time.
Yep.
But I think in principle having a benchmark would be very helpful.
Yeah.
I think
Okay.
there's a different way of coming at that problem, rather than imposing a sort of slightly arbitrary deadline on investigations, which are by their very nature different, which would just be one of greater transparency, where the IOPC is much clearer about the time it's expecting things to take, why that's the case, provide more frequent updates. And I think there's two different ways of coming at the problem. There is the sort of benchmark approach, there's transparency. I suppose there's a third way, which is you combine them both and you have it all together. But I do think the transparency element and more public explanation, both from IOPC and the Met, about where things have got to in these cases would be helpful.
Okay, thank you. Both of you, probably from a different direction, how are complainants and officers supported during the complaints process, and how can this be improved?
Yes, well, we have a large number of officers, we have a large number of complaints that come in from members of the public, and a significant number of misconduct cases ongoing for long periods of time. Officer welfare is, of course, vital, particularly if the officer is restricted or indeed suspended from duty, although the decision to suspend is only for the most serious of cases and where it is definitely in the public interest that the officer isn't at work. The welfare is for us to provide. It is always a consideration when I make the decisions about whether an officer is suspended, and I continually review them. It's my responsibility. They will have welfare SPOCs in place. They will have Federation support, but very often that is strained. Very often the officer will feel that they are being overly scrutinised, don't agree with the investigation. There is a parting of minds in relation to their wanting to engage with the with their line management or with their welfare officers, and it can be a very challenging situation. Particularly, of course, that we need to be fair and impartial, and whilst there is a serious investigation ongoing, it needs to be proven, and we need to provide that support. To improve that, well, clearly the timeliness would have a massive impact on that. I'm not sure that I have any other particular answers, because we do put a lot of effort into ensuring that they have got all the support that they need, regular contact, and that they have got support networks, families, GPs, counselling, whatever else that they might need, and the Federation will also provide a very important role there.
How many officers are actually off work at the moment, have been suspended in the Metropolitan Police?
53.
53 at the moment?
Yes.
And what's the longest period of time somebody's been suspended?
I don't know exactly, but there will be one or two where it's a number of years. That is mostly because of their particular circumstance.
Okay.
It wouldn't be appropriate for me to go into...
No, I don't want you to go into any detail. We all understand that.
Yes, but there will be reasons why we have not been able to progress it, and therefore it's suspended is in terms of progressing it, not because we aren't ready to do it.
Okay. We can't go into details, it would be inappropriate, but that's quite alarming in its own way. And what about the complainants, Kenny? How are they supported if these things go on for years?
So we technically have no role in that, and MOPAC's complaint will either be made to the force directly, or if it is made in the first instance to the Iopc, or indeed to us, then it gets referred back into the Met as the initial position, who'll then make an assessment and come up. The only time in which, obviously on high profile cases we will be made aware, but it's only if somebody is dissatisfied with the way in which a complaint to the Met has been handled that would be notified to us under the new regulations around us as a relevant review body, at which stage we would acknowledge receipt and be in contact with them every 28 days until such time as that had been resolved. Clearly, if the complainant is actually a witness at the time of the complaint or a victim, they will be receiving, or can receive should they decide to do so, through the London Witness and Victim Service, which is partly funded by MOPAC. But other than that, we actually have no official role in that.
No. Of course, timeliness, as you quite rightfully say, is one of the key ones there. Do you agree with the Home Affairs Select Committee that the Iopc needs to broaden its recruitment base for investigations? And what do you consider would be the base staffing level of investigators in the Iopc?
I don't know that I would be able to effectively answer that question, other than, yes, I think they would need to have more investigators. That would help with the timeliness. But I do also accept that from a public perception, you can't recruit ex-police officers to do that. And of course that is the main base for professional expert investigators here. So it does prove difficult for them. I can understand that.
Yeah, I think we can all understand that. Kenny, can I ask you, how is the Iopc held to account when it does get decisions wrong? Who holds them to account?
So it's a very good question, Chair. So when there is, so it's very difficult to say whether they've got a decision right or wrong per se, in the same way that if you think about the CPS or the police taking a case to a court and then the jury acquits somebody, that's not to say that the police or the CPS were wrong per se to pursue that case. However, in cases, there are cases where, as Commander Savell said, actually there may be wide discrepancies between the judgment between the police and the Iopc as to whether something should, for example, be reflective practice or it equates to gross misconduct. I don't think they are large in number, but those cases do exist. And I think, if I'm not wrong, that the only way in which that could be challenged would be for the Metropolitan Police as the interested party to take a judicial review against the Iopc, because where there is a disagreement, the process which is set out is that the Metropolitan Police will get sight of the initial view of the decision maker within the Iopc. The Metropolitan Police will be able to submit their views on that, although, let's be honest, their views will already be pretty much known by the Iopc following the referral. But there is, ultimately the decision maker in the Iopc will come to their own independent view on that, whether or not that accords with the Met's view, and at that stage, if I'm wrong, I will write to the committee, but I believe that the only way to challenge that would be by way of a formal judicial review. I don't think there is any other sort of review mechanism which is set out by the statute.
Perhaps we'll go through that with the Iopc. Have you got anything to add, Commander?
Only that Kenny's absolutely right in how the process works, and I completely agree that we have very limited options if we completely disagree with their finding. It doesn't happen very often, so we know to put that into perspective. And in the process of their initial determination, referral to us, our assessment and discussion backwards, I think I would describe that we have a very professional and productive relationship at that level with the Iopc, and often the final determination is changed. So it isn't in every case that, you know, I wouldn't want to paint the picture where heels are dug in on every single case. But there are some where actually we do have a massive disagreement and think that that is completely wrong. And the only way to be able to challenge that is judicial review, which we obviously don't undertake lightly. It's long, lengthy, expensive, and often I think we could find a better way of solving that.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm now going to hand over to Assembly Member Devonish.
Good morning, Commander. How do prolonged investigations and the effect of having staff suspended or on restricted duty impact the Met operationally, please?
Reasonably significantly, I think would be the answer. So you've heard that we have 53 officers suspended. The bar is very high for suspension. The first assessment is that the breach of the standards is such that it's gross misconduct, and therefore the officer may lose their job if there is a finding. And secondly, that they can't be effectively managed in the workplace under restrictions, and it is in the public interest that they are not in the workplace. So there's a high bar, and I'm the decision maker, and there are 53 of those. But there are over 400 that are subject to restrictions. Now, in almost all instances, that would be not public facing. Sometimes it will be a restriction in relation to a type of case or being involved in the evidential chain. But in effect, there is somewhere between 450 and 500 officers that are not able to do a fully operational role that we would want them to do. Now, we know the size of the Met, that's quite a significant number, and will impact on every area. It's a very difficult line to tread in terms of the decision making about whether we should restrict or suspend, because there is a public trust and confidence issue there, and the optics of that, where if there is a determination by the Iopc, for example, that there is a case to answer, we need to respect that. We need to therefore have to review and possibly apply restrictions and suspensions, sometimes when we don't agree that that level is met. But for obvious reasons, having that number of officers restricted or suspended will of course have an impact on policing London and the service we give to the public.
Thank you. You've answered my next question with the 400 figure. My final question is, and probably you can write to the committee please on this, can you provide the committee with a breakdown of the length of time officers have been suspended or placed on restricted duties pending Iopc investigations? And could I add, perhaps you can do it for the last perhaps 6 years to give us a proper data so we can actually see how it's gone up and down.
Of course. So Iopc independent investigations, the length of time an officer will have been suspended or on restrictions.
Yes, please.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Back to the Chair.
Thank you. Now we're going to Assembly Member Ahmed.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, panel. Commander Savell, Sir Stephen House, the Acting Commissioner, told this committee on the 26th of May that he could not answer our questions about an incident as the case was currently under investigation and he was under a warning from the Iopc. Should the Iopc address this specific issue of providing clear guidance to senior officers on how they can speak to scrutiny bodies on cases subject to Iopc investigations?
Thank you. I'm aware of the question and Sir Steve's response, and the response that Michael Lockwood has given in relation to the protocol that sits in place between National Police Chiefs Council and the Iopc about media and media handling. In all cases where it's an independent investigation, the Iopc are the lead in relation to media. We can only respond to that. It is a very difficult line to tread in terms of very often comments are misconstrued by media, and the inclusion of some words leads to an assumption that something has happened, which is a significant negative impact on trust and confidence when the investigation hasn't been completed. So I think that we would want to be really clear about exactly what we can say that manages some of the inappropriate reporting which leads to negative trust and confidence issues, that doesn't disrupt the independence of their investigation. And it is a fine line to tread, but I do think at the moment, in effect, the protocol is we shouldn't say anything about a case. In these times when people's interpretation of what has gone on is often not what the actual outcome is, that very early ability for us to be able to agree with the Iopc, the wording that would assist us in managing community upset about something as best as way we possibly can, would be very helpful. And I do think we are in a difficult position with that. At the moment, the protocol is that we shouldn't say anything.
Thank you, Commander. Mr. Bowie, how does the IOPC's work inform your oversight of the Met?
So it informs it in numerous ways, if I'm honest, generally. So recently the Mayor met with Michael Lockwood and Sal Nassim, who's the Regional Director. Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime, Sophie Linden, has regular meetings with Sal. Me and my team particularly, meet with IOPC regularly and we look and hear from them about what the themes and are coming out of their investigations. We look at the learning recommendations, whether they're the Section 10s or the 28As, which come out, and how the Met will be responding to them, and then we feed all of that insight, which we get in the same way as we do with HMIC FRS reports and discussions with Inspector Parr and others, into whether it's our formal oversight board, whether it's bilateral meetings, or whether it's discussions that my team and I have with John, which in fact we had after our catch up on Monday this week, where we were looking at that and we were trying to cross-reference IOPC data with Met data to make sure that we were getting the right sort of oversight of the highest profile cases within the Metropolitan Police. So it feeds in. I wouldn't want to oversell it and say it's absolutely central, but it feeds in the same way as other oversight bodies like HMIC FRS, or when the college does work. We'll take all of that learning, try and look at it, try and pull out thematic strategic issues rather than sort of single tactical issues in a case, and make sure that that gets fed up to both the Deputy Mayor and the Mayor for the necessary discussions if we can't have them at our sort of officer level. But in a large number of cases, we are able to deal very constructively with John and his team or other areas and get the responses that we actually need.
Could that process be improved in any way?
Every process in the world can be improved in some ways, would be my answer to that. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's exactly what John and I are looking to do at the moment. The meeting on Monday was the first of a new monthly meeting which we have put in place at a more strategic level, where we are trying to pull out exactly what are the themes which are coming out, not just from the IOPC but from the Met's own Professional Standards Directorate investigations and work. Look at how that does impact on trust and confidence overall. It can be improved through MOPAC and my team in particular having an improved understanding of the way in which John's team's work. We are a relevant review body in the same way that the IOPC is for cases which might touch upon a certain sort of gross misconduct or gross misconduct level, and we could definitely do more to feedback. We can always do more to feedback exactly the insights that we glean from that into John's team to improve how that works there. I mean, to be fair, that has happened, and John's team have set up a complaints resolution unit in the last, I think it only went live earlier this year, 7th of February, thank you. That's not directly down to us, but that's part of the learning which has come through all of this new system. So yes, of course, it can always be improved. We are always trying to do that. Monday was the first of a hopefully new and even better system, but I wouldn't say we've been sort of sitting there doing nothing for the last wee while.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair.
Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you, Chair. So my first question I'm actually going to direct to the Commander, which is how effective do you think the Met's Professional Standards Department is?
I think it can be better. I think we can always be better. Organisational learning and continuous improvement is a constant theme. You will know that we, as part of our Rebuilding Trust Plan, were public about reviewing all of our current investigations and some historic cases into domestic abuse and serious sexual offences perpetrated by police officers and staff. Very fulsome, very detailed, over 400 cases looked at, a number of recommendations that we have taken on board. Some of them are very simple process changes, just recognise there are some gaps. Some of them will take a bit more in relation to training, but that's a really good example of how we are always looking to improve. I would be foolish to say that we are great at it because there are so many variables in there, but we are focusing on training, we're focusing on capability, we're constantly looking at the systems, the processes, the information sharing, and we have had further investment in my command, more officers investigating serious offences and serious misconduct, rightly so.
Thank you. In the case of Bianca Williams and Ricardo dos Santos, we were told by the Acting Commissioner that the case was reviewed, and I quote, twice by two separate teams of officers from Professional Standards. Neither team saw anything wrong with it. The Iopc concluded that there is a case to answer for gross misconduct against 5 Metropolitan Police officers. So how do you think there can be such a discrepancy between the findings of the Met, not once but twice, and the Iopc?
I'm going to have to say that I have to be very careful about how I answer that question because it is a very live, current case. I would only be able to talk in generalist terms in relation to, very often we will quickly look at the body-worn video to make our assessment, which is a very different to then having a very thorough investigation and interviewing people and looking at all of the other social media and everything else. So, you know, I think that we will always make a very quick assessment for our learning, if nothing else. You know, if an investigation can take a very long time, we can't wait for that to identify if there was a training issue, for example. So we would want to do a very quick look at exactly what happened. But I don't want to speak about that case.
Of course. But do you think there's anything that you can learn from this in terms of the nature of that quick look? Is there more that should come into scope of that quick look to form an initial assessment?
It's a very good question. I don't know what the parameters are in relation to my officers when they do those early assessments, but it is something that I'll ask the question about.
Thank you. And just last night, it was reported that the police at the Sarah Everard vigil became defensive, reacting to a perception of hostility in the crowd. Do you have a view in relation to professional standards on the behaviour of officers at the Sarah Everard vigil?
I'm afraid I don't know enough about it in order to be able to give you any sort of realistic comment. It has been reviewed by Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary very thoroughly and reported on, and I think I would have to defer back to their findings, which would be far more detailed than anything I'm afraid I know.
Thank you. And Mr. Bowie, how effective do you think the Met's Professional Standards Department is, and how are you monitoring the work of the Met's Professional Standards Department?
So I'll refer back to my previous answer where I think everything can always get better. But that's not to say that we think they are doing a poor job by any means. What I mean by that is we were very pleased with the uplift which went into John's area of extra investigators. The Mayor and the Deputy Mayor think it's very, very important for trust and public confidence in the Met that the Met are proactively able to identify wrongdoing within their organisation. I know that's something that the Acting Commissioner and all of the Met senior leadership would sign up to as well. So from that perspective, we think that is definitely a step in the right direction. We were very pleased with the creation of the complaints resolution unit. We are already starting to see, it's probably too early to say whether it's a genuine trend or whether it's just a sort of blip at this stage, but the number of reviews which are coming through to us do seem to be going in a downwards direction, which I would suggest is a positive thing and something which we would like to see sustained over time. Do I think that there will be areas which John can speak better to me about where things could improve? Yes, I think one of the things we would think would benefit would be just, as I said earlier, would be greater transparency around some of the data, the facts and the figures, the explaining to the public in what I would call plain English rather than talking. I mean, I think we're all guilty of this, me as much as anybody, of speaking in police or legalese at certain times and actually just putting things in a way which it's not helped, in all honesty, by some of the regulations which you're forced to comply with. And I'm sure the advice which we all get from the legal people is if you stick to the legal wording, you can't go wrong. But I'm not sure that always helps with the with actually explaining to Londoners what's going on. How does Oversight work? Well, in various and how does our work together work? So every week there is a meeting between the lead in my team and the chief superintendent in John's team to discuss what is coming up, what those cases are, get details on it, and ask questions. Every month there is a meeting between John, myself, and the teams where we take a strategic look at what are the themes which are coming out of this. We also discuss, in the same way that we look at HMICFRS recommendations, we would look at the learning recommendations which come from the Iopc and speak to John and his team, or if it's not for John's area, for example, if it relates to what's going on in Stop and Search, you might speak to the ACC frontline, Nick F. Grave, about how are they actually taking account of that and bringing that into the practice. Then, as I said, we have regular meetings between both the Mayor and the Deputy Mayor with the Iopc where we can discuss both what do they think about is going on within the Met. This isn't just in Commander Savell's area, but more generally. And then we can use all of that insight to inform the Mayor, the Deputy Mayor, our CEOs, bilaterals with senior Met officials and ask them questions about what we've heard and how that chimes with what we're hearing from all of our other scrutiny mechanisms.
Thank you. I think what you were saying just a bit earlier about the need for transparency and also ordinary language, just in terms of Londoners understanding what's happening and the context around particularly some of the more kind of newsworthy cases is well made. And then further for you, Mr. Bowie, what proportion of gross misconduct cases brought by the Iopc against Met officers are found to be proven by misconduct panels?
So I don't have the total on that. I can see that in the last 12 months to March 2022.
Can you put your microphone? Sorry, thank you.
That's my way of buying time there, Chair. Sorry, you spotted me. So in the last 12 months to March 2022, I don't have the exact figures of gross misconduct or others, but I think there were 91 hearings which were either normal track or accelerated cases, are ones where I believe a criminal conviction has happened previously and are chaired by an assistant chief constable. I think 90% of the police officers were found to be proven at those hearings, and 74% of the police officers were dismissed or would have been dismissed, and the would have been dismissed are cases where the officer has either retired or resigned in the interim period.
Right, in our briefing we've got some information.
You put your microphone.
It's catching. In our briefing, we've got some information that in January 2019, the BBC reported on figures that had been obtained via FOI, which showed 2/3 of the 48 gross misconduct cases brought by the IOPC in the 3 years to October 2018 were found not proven at misconduct hearings, and only 5 hearings actually resulted in dismissals. Do you have any views on that?
I have views that there's a huge discrepancy between the figures that we've both just provided, and I should probably go back and have a look at that. I would say those are very likely national figures which you've provided up to 2019, and I think I've just provided Metropolitan Police figures.
Thank you. Is that the point you were going to make? Yeah. Thank you very much. And what work is being done to reduce the disconnect between the findings made by the IOPC and the decisions that are made by misconduct panels?
So I don't necessarily think it is our place to intervene in an independent investigative process, and then the panels which are chaired by legally qualified chairs, we do appoint the legally qualified chairs, and then obviously the Met and their independent counsel will present the case. In rare cases, although as Commander Savell said, it is starting to happen now, that IOPC will present the case where there's a discrepancy, and we certainly welcome that. We have recently written to all of the LQCs, though, just to make the point about public, I mean particularly when it comes to the police officers who have been convicted of criminal events, just to make the point about how will I put this, the fact that I think public trust and confidence in the Metropolitan Police as a whole is generally damaged when officers who may have a criminal conviction are allowed to remain in the force. I think the public generally find that quite a difficult position to understand. But as I say, in general, it's a very difficult line to tread, because it's not appropriate for the Mayor or the Deputy Mayor to put political pressure on either independent investigators or on the independent legally qualified chairs. And so I should also say it's not appropriate for me or any public servant to do that either.
Thank you. Commander Savell, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, only that we're talking about IOPC independent investigations. I think I would say that you'd have to ask the IOPC if they are looking at why where there is such a discrepancy. I don't know if they are doing any work. Certainly we would do case reviews where our determination is not upheld at the end of an independent panel, just for learning ourselves. So, you know.
Well, that's a question we can put to them when they come before us. Thank you, Chair.
Yes, we certainly will, and they've got plenty of notice of that, because I am sure if nothing else they'll be watching. Assembly Member Pigeon.
Thank you. One of the things that struck me from our discussion this morning is that there seems to be a lack of data here, or lack of transparency around the data. And I know we've asked for some figures for the last 6 years, but actually the IOPC was only set up in 2018. Do the IOPC present to MOPAC quarterly, annually, the figures for the Met officers they're investigating and the different stages and so on? And is that part of your sort of routine monitoring with them? And is that available? Because I try to understand, because you've got different levels of complaints. You've got the IOPC ones, you've got the ones that the Met will be looking at. Where's the comprehensive picture? Where can we look at that data to understand? And how do you as MOPAC compare it to other forces? Because there must be an issue, and you can always say, can't compare the Met because we're so big, but you could, per 1,000 officers, how many complaints are there? How do I know if the Met actually is very low, or actually it's really high and really out of step, particularly when we've all got concerns about the culture at the moment in the Met?
So I think that's a very, very good question, and I would personally be very supportive of seeing data presented which would allow us as an oversight body to compare how the Metropolitan Police is doing in comparison, well, is doing, it's probably the wrong way, but how the Metropolitan Police compares with other forces, both in terms of how many officers or staff are subject to criminal conviction, or actually better when would be convicted at trial, I suppose, of that, how many gross misconduct cases are brought, how many times are there discrepancies. So I would be very supportive of any work that can be done at a national level to bring that forward, and I suspect, though Commander Savell will correct me here, that may be a joint thing to be coordinated between sort of NPCC and Iopc at some stage. In terms of how do we get the data and how do we compare it, that was one of the things which Commander Savell and I were actually discussing on Monday, where we had the list of Iopc cases subject to which related to the Metropolitan Police. They were given in a slight code way, so for perfectly sensible reasons around not wanting to reveal personal data on things, but Commander Savell has taken to go away and cross-check that across with the files that he has, so that we are able to do that. At the moment, we, to my best of my understanding, and I'll correct this if it's wrong, do not, other than that, get detailed breakdowns from the Iopc. Would we want that? I think we are, so long as we have a complete picture of the cases and what's going on. I am more interested, to be honest, in the thematic learning as an oversight body that comes out from those cases, and understanding whether any of those cases are likely, when they become public at any stage, to have issues in certain communities or impacts on public trust and confidence, so that we can work with the Metropolitan Police, with local community organisations, to make sure that we are ready for that and able to mitigate the sort of any negative impacts that may come from that. But if the main premise of your point there is, I think, should there be more data which allows a comparison of the Metropolitan Police Service with other forces throughout the country, I would be very, very supportive of that.
I'm kind of surprised MOPAC hasn't thought that's something you would want to see, and to have been pushing it, whether it's with other PCCs across the country or when you meet with Iopc. But do you have a clear picture of the complaints that the Met are investigating?
So just to be clear, I didn't say that wasn't something that MOPAC had wanted or had been pushing. I'm just saying I would very much welcome that. I'm not going to get into sort of some of the private
right, but that is something you've been seeking. No, that's helpful.
That's okay. Then do I think the new meeting which we have instituted between Commander Savell and myself is going to be a big step in the right direction in terms of getting a complete picture in terms of what MOPAC needs and wants and what the Metropolitan Police has. I think it's fair to say that the issue of police discipline, misconduct, the views of Iopc and how that is shaping Metropolitan Police culture and public trust and confidence in the Met has really shot up the agenda in the last probably 12 to 18 months. We are responding to that, as are the Met, in terms of how we set ourselves up internally. There's also been a lot of learning for us as MOPAC through the setting up of the complaints, us as a relevant review body, and what the levels of work which has come in was far higher than we were expecting. I mean, we had to make various assumptions when setting the team up. So I do think all of that is coming together, and we are getting a far better picture overall of where things are.
Well, perhaps our officers can try and pull together what data, and I'd like to see the City and of London Police and BTP as well, because they do affect the City. If we can get any London data there for our next meeting, that would be helpful. But obviously MOPAC deals with complaints about the Commissioner, conduct of the Commissioner. How satisfied are you with the process you have there? What are your timescales for those complaints and completing investigations? And can you give us some idea of the figures that you are dealing with? How many complaints come in?
So the figures which come in are very, very small. I think in the year I've been there, I can't think of more than one case. I think only been one case in the year that I'm there. If that's wrong, I will certainly write to you. It probably is wrong, given you're looking at your paper like that. But that's No, that's okay. But if that...
Well, perhaps you can give us
very
a
small
flavour
number.
for the last few years.
Yeah, yeah.
Because,
So,
and do you look at the Deputy Commissioner as well, or is that
I
dealt
think
with by...
it's just
the Commissioner?
Yeah.
Okay.
I have great faith in the system that we have on that. We have a senior member of my team who personally looks at all of those, who is very experienced, who knows the system, the regulations, the system very well. And then it obviously goes up to our Chief Executive Officer to consider it, who is a public servant of many years standing and whose integrity I have absolutely no doubt over. And those are dealt with in as timely a fashion as they can be. In the same way as Commander Savell was saying earlier, it is impossible to say what is the right timescale for this, because these really are pretty major decisions, and I would rather, in all honesty, on that we got it, given the numbers are so small, that we got it very, very right. Not to the extent that it takes a year as opposed to a week sort of thing, and these things are always a spectrum, but I would rather go as quickly as we possibly can to do it as thoroughly as possible and make sure that the decision is absolutely beyond reproach. And I think that, given that the numbers are very small, is a sensible way of doing it. And I'm very satisfied that we have the necessary firewalls in place within MOPAC between the public servant side and the political side to avoid there being any perception of interference in that regard.
Yeah, I think it would just be really helpful if we could get, at some point, pulled together this data. I mean, the predecessor body of the Iopc used to brief the Metropolitan Police Authority. I think it was quarterly, and we got an annual report very clear, so we could understand and get that picture of where the Met was and where there might be issues. And I think it would be helpful if MOPAC had that, but also for us as a committee, if that's something going forward, we might be able to secure that rounded data. My final question is, the Iopc is developing and needs resourcing and all that, but actually they're now producing lots of learning reports. We've seen their one on stop and search. Is there sort of a muddying of the role in some ways between Iopc and the HMI, who also produce thematic reports? All of these bodies, rightly, are making suggestions and recommendations for the Met Police. Might there be scope here for some confusion, some duplication, and is it perhaps, causing issues and tensions if bodies come up with slightly different recommendations?
I'll defer here to Commander Savell
Maybe
for
Commander
what their
Savell,
view on that is. My view is that we, I think on the stop and search, the general approach set out by HMICFRS and the Iopc is in a broadly similar place in actual fact, so I don't think that has arisen. Is there a potential for tension? Well, there always is, but in many cases it's good to have different people looking at different things and different perspectives, and certainly from a scrutiny perspective, I'm sure the Met would, certain elements of the Met would say, well, that we come to different views to HMICFRS or the Iopc sometimes on certain things as well. So I don't necessarily think that is a negative view. To very reasonable people looking at the same set of facts sometimes come to different views and things, don't they? And I think that's pretty reasonable, but
Commander, have you got any thoughts on that?
Yes, thank you. I don't see that there's any particular muddying of the waters. We welcome the IOPC learning recommendations, so they will either take the form of a thematic, so for example stop and search, which would be national, but particularly for us here in London, where they will produce a learning report and learning recommendations in relation to a specific incident they've investigated. They are very welcome. We pay lots of attention to them in almost every instance, with perhaps some discussion about some of the wording. We accept the recommendations and implement them and respond and keep them updated, and I think it's a very useful vehicle. HMIC will generally do thematic type inspections or their appeal inspections, but I agree with Kenny that very rarely are they at odds, and the IOPC have a more specific role, which is in the main related to specific incidents that have gone wrong that we can learn from.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assemblymember Garrett.
Oh, good morning. We've had a lot of detailed questions, so I had a sort of big picture question, really. So if you think about this whole process of complaints against police, thinking about the police investigation part, the Iopc part, and the panel that we've talked about, you've got conflicting needs for that system in the sense that whether officers who've committed serious wrongdoing, obviously that we would want to see those officers removed promptly, where you have officers who've committed more minor wrongdoing, we want to see corrective action and improvement. Obviously for the public confidence, the public would want to see that those things are investigated properly and fairly. Officers themselves obviously are entitled to a fair hearing and an opportunity to put their side, particularly I suppose sometimes there must be vexatious or almost vindictive complaints made against officers at times. All of that needing to happen promptly for the reasons that we've already talked about. So sort of thinking about all of that, and again, obviously some of those things are in conflict, which bits of that process or which elements of those aims do you think are working well, and where do you think there's some room to sort of focus improvement? Perhaps if you could start, Commander.
Oh, and thank you. It's a very big question because there are so many moving parts, and the statutory regulations are indeed very complex and have changed, and sometimes you have to go back to the old regulations depending on how old the gate. So it is. It's very strictly controlled, and you know, part of that will be recognition of the office of constable and the independence that a constable has. And we're not an employment contractual sort of basis, and therefore, you know, the police can't immediately dispense the services of an officer, and it gives that, you know, that's the basis of it in effect. Some of the regulations are set time scales to do things, not to do things within and to reduce, but actually they stretch things out. So a prime example is myself, the Commissioner, and anybody that works in the Met that sees a police officer convicted of a criminal offence wants to see them removed from the organisation as quickly as possible. The regulations are set out where notices have to be served, have to be responded to. And I don't know, but it's roughly 3 to 4 weeks is about the quickest you can then remove an officer from the force when they've been convicted of a rape, for example. Well, I think you and I would all want to be servicing that notice on the steps of the court. So there are bits of the regulations, and I'm sure colleagues from the Police Federation and elsewhere would want to make sure that there is fairness in the process. But there are bits of it which, quite frankly, I think needs to be reviewed, and that's a little example. Another is very new officers within their probation, starting out on their long, hopefully, and fulfilling career, are subject to different regulations around performance. Now, there are things that new recruits do which sadly breach the standards, and we would much rather be in a position where we could use that very early unsatisfactory performance regime to exit an officer from the organisation quickly, because they've been in for a few weeks, months, etc., and clearly are not the sort of person, even with the vetting and the recruitment processes, that actually is going to make an efficient and effective constable. But again, they're not designed for dealing with that. The officer, the incident has to be admitted. It's not designed for dealing with misconduct. Well, I think that if someone is in those very early days and quite clearly are doing things they shouldn't be doing, we don't want to then have those in those organisations for a very long time. So there are bits of the regulation that we think we would like to see changed to help us with trust and confidence and really dealing with people that shouldn't be a police officer. I think that certainly within London and within the Met, the way that the regulations are used, we use them as efficiently as and effectively as we possibly can. And my hearings and litigation unit, which runs all of the misconduct hearings, about 100 a year, as you heard Kenny say. We have what are hearing rooms. They're like courtrooms. It is a well-oiled machine, and all of the lawyers that are involved in it are very complimentary about how well it works. So there are bits of the system which are working very well. But I think overall, there is room for looking at how the regulations work in terms of some of those slightly perverse outcomes when there are officers that shouldn't be serving, and we have to, they are remain in the force and very often remain on full pay, and I think that sticks in everybody's throat.
Thanks, that's interesting. Kenny, did you have anything on the big picture question as well?
No, so I would 100% agree with what Commander Savell has said. I think particularly the fact that the regulations are quite complex, and where there are individuals that clearly we would not want to see serving within the Metropolitan Police Service, where they are fairly, well, to my mind anyway, open and closed cases. I do think it should be a bit of a quicker process. I would also go back to what I said earlier about resources for the Iopc. I mean, it is vastly improved, as I said, from the IPCC days, and most of the investigations are completed within 12 months now. But I still think there is just something about the fact that if that could be quicker, if there could be an uplift to recognise the fact that there are more officers, there will be more complaints just by the very nature of the sheer numbers across the country now. I do think that would be a sort of good thing. I think there is also, I don't quite know how we do this, but just a way of attracting more legally qualified chairs as well. I think we're at 13 in London at the moment, but just having a greater number so that things can be scheduled more quickly as needs be, etc., would always be of benefit as well. But I tend to agree with Commander Savell. I think the sort of number, the hearings work pretty well. And again, just to go back to what I said earlier, I think what would also help would be transparency. This goes back to Assemblymember Pidgeon's point to some extent, and Assemblymember Amma, just about numbers and comparative performance and where are we in all of this, and speaking to being able to update and provide information about the process and the systems in a plain English sort of a way. I really do think expectations and understandings at the outset would help public trust and confidence in the whole system, and then, as I say, some of the capacity issues within the Iopc, given they are a demand-led organisation.
Thanks. Just very quickly, the regulations you referred to, those are national regulations set by government, are they?
Yeah, they're set by the Home Office. I think it's the Police Professionalism and Standards Unit in the Home Office.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Can I just ask, have discussions been had with Kit Malthouse about these regulations, about changing them? Because we all hear what you're saying and agree.
I'm not aware that they have. Some of that is a personal view, but a personal professional view. I know that we are looking at what we could put forward to propose to national policing, because it's a national policing issue.
Yes.
And there is a national policing lead. Chief Constable Craig Guilford from Nottinghamshire Police is the lead on professional standards. It would be for us, through policing, to do a representation to the Home Office and to the policing minister around that. So
I'd
yes.
certainly urge you to get on with that, because I don't think anybody could disagree with what you've just said. Thank you. Going over now to Assembly Member Sahota.
Thank you, Chair. Forgive me, I may be asking very basic questions because I'm new to this committee, but tell me that as a member of the public, if I have a complaint about the police, do I make it to the Iopc directly, or do I make it to the police force?
You'd make it to us. So we have a complaint resolution unit. It's a large unit that's now set up down in South East London. And then depending on the nature of the complaint, we'll then determine where it goes. A member of the public can complain to the Iopc, but in most instances they will refer you back to the police first of all. And then depending on the nature of the complaint, we may then refer it to the Iopc.
So what's that threshold that makes you refer to the Iopc?
So there are 3 thresholds for us to refer a complaint or a potential misconduct to the Iopc. One is where there is death or serious injury following police contact, which is sort of relatively, as it says, although the criteria is either the person has suffered that death or serious injury whilst in police custody or under the control of the police, or has recently had contact with the police, and that contact might have contributed to it. So actually the bar again is quite low. You then got mandatory referrals where there is serious criminality, and again I think it's reasonably obvious, you know, if an officer is arrested for a criminal offence, we refer it to the Iopc. And then there's a voluntary referral, which is a catch-all for anything else that we consider actually is sufficiently serious or has sufficient impact on public confidence, or we think it needs an independent oversight. We will refer it. And we refer a lot. And I would, my view is, and the conversations I've had with the Iopc are that we are quite good at making referrals, and they're not very often are there things that we should have referred that we haven't. Mm-hmm. The Iopc will then make a view as to the method of investigation. So they'll make an assessment of it, but they'll also work out whether they have the capability and capacity to deal with it or not, and they will then make a decision about whether they independently deal with it, whether they oversee us, or whether they just give it back to us to investigate.
I was just reading here that in the year 2020 to 21, there were 67,732 complaints logged by police bodies nationally, but of only these, 36,000 were handled formally as recorded complaints. So what's the discrepancy? Why is the recorded complaints different from the number of complaints lodged with the police bodies?
So I think the answer to the question is in relation to complaints coming into the police rather than to the Iopc. Is that the...
No, the question here, all it says is that 67,000 complaints were logged by police bodies nationally. Of these, 36,000 were handled formally as recorded complaints. And I'm just saying, what's the difference between a recorded complaint?
I think the Commander was getting the answer right there.
Yeah, so I think that the issue, or the way that it's dealt with, is it's a regulatory issue, but in effect, you phone the complaints resolution unit, or you email them, or you know, online form. We will seek to deal with that as quickly as possible. We've reduced the amount of time significantly in order to do that. If the complaint is able to be dealt with satisfactorily, quickly, it's logged on our system, but it's not a formally recorded complaint, which then enters into the system. So I think that's what your cut-off is. Okay, so there are some complaints which come in, but you're able to deal them very quickly or informally without formally escalating to the formal complaint. Yes. Okay. And so, the question from the public perception is of all the complaints made, only 1.3%, right? Sorry, of all the complaints made, 13% are referred actually to the Iopc. The referral rate is only 13% of all national, I'm talking about national figures. And of those 13% referred, only 10% are investigated by the Iopc, which is a very small number of the total number of complaints. Which seems, do you think that does much to build up confidence in the Iopc? Well, I think there will be an awful lot that sits behind that statistic, and probably a question for the Iopc. And I would only say, in terms of overall police complaints, very often it's someone who is aggrieved about having had an interaction with a police officer when we're carrying out our duty, which can be dealt with politely and effectively and to their satisfaction. Not many actually get to the point where within that complaint there is evidence of misconduct, which then requires an investigation. But I think probably the Iopc would be best to answer.
And just finally, of all the complaints which are referred to the Iopc, there's ones which reach this trigger point which you have to refer, and then there's these ones which you voluntarily refer. Are the outcomes different from the ones you voluntarily refer? I mean, the percentage of findings against the police, right? Is there statistically difference between the voluntary referrals and the ones which are referred as because you have to refer them to them?
I'm afraid I don't know the answers to that.
Can you find that answer for me, please?
I will see if we can. We see if we have that data. Yes.
Thank you very much.
The last question on this section is from Assembly Member Mayor.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you, Kenny, and perhaps Commander Savell, you might have a view on this. If there is this move to thematic reviews, there are particular issues around disproportionality and the impact of policing on black and minority ethnic Londoners, with the way in which they are policed or the perception of that. And I know that a small proportion of the Section 60s that are served to deal with what the police consider to be kind of high likelihood of violent crimes happening. I guess, okay, my point is really, how do you know that that issue is widespread, and will there be a way in which you're going to figure out where by borough command that 1.5% of Section 60s happens? Are they concentrated and so on? I wonder what the level of granularity is to then inform the recommendations that the Iopc make, bearing in mind that they're looking at stuff nationally, and with the best will in the world, a lot of the stuff that they may recommend is very, just by its nature, it becomes quite diluted and may not be as useful to the Met in dealing with some of the issues that it's trying to address, particularly in light of a new commissioner coming along.
So I think there's two slightly separate issues within that. So if we take the stop and search issue first, and the issue of disproportionality, particularly within Section 60, as you say, actually the disproportionality board, which we've set up in MOPAC, which includes the Iopc, Commander Harper from the Metropolitan Police, and others, we are going to be kicking off a bit of work under that to look at exactly whether it is possible to explain the levels of disproportionality in stop and search. I've had the first of a task in Finnish group, which includes the Iopc, the Metropolitan Police and others, to look at how we can actually form, how we actually frame the research question in a way which will try and get to some of the answers to some of the questions, if it's possible to get those answers that you're posing there. So I think that's the first point. The second point, I would say, is about, we within Evidence and Insights have done we've done 2 bits of work and are currently just completing a third bit to look at disproportionality within the sort of, how to put it, within the MPS misconduct process. And this will, and obviously the largest number of complaints, if you like, which come in from members of the public are generally about use of force, which will include stop and search. I think that's about 23% of all of the public complaints which come in. And actually, interestingly, within that, what it shows is that generally there is some levels of disproportionality in terms of referral into the misconduct process, but once the misconduct process is actually underway and concludes that the disproportionality at that point doesn't actually exist, so whether you're black, white, Asian or other sort of minority ethnic officer or member of staff, you will get the same likelihood of each sort of outcome.
But that suggests that it does, because if you are black and you're more likely to be referred for misconduct, and it means that once you're in the system, everyone is treated equally. It does mean that you're more likely to get away with it if you're white, right? As in not to be referred in the first place.
Well, that's exactly that was the point I was making. So just because we're on the actual misconduct process, I was making the point that there isn't a thing, because that's the point. There are wider discussions about the referrals in, and whether the public are making the complaints about that, or whether it's officer-made referrals, or it's the Met's whistleblowing service, other things which, yes, need to be looked at. But I do think it's an important process as we look at the misconduct process here, that we note that there isn't actually disproportionality within that. How people get into that process, yes, I agree with you, there is a question to be looked at within that regard.
Just so I can clarify, so my question initially was trying to be helpful, that if there is a point about a concentration of where those Section 60s and other slightly more direct contact happen with the police, it would be helpful to then, because I was intrigued when we were talking about the learning reports and those learnings that the Met have taken on, the various IPC reports that accepted their recommendations, but at the same time there's this gap about whether or not there's a suspension of disbelief. It just seems like we will take on board the recommendations, we don't really agree the substance of the recommendation or the basis for it, which in itself doesn't instill trust or confidence for somebody. So if there are potentially issues of systemic disproportionality and the IOPC may say something, but the Met as a whole or in parts doesn't accept that there is, but I wonder what faith people have in whether or not that recommendation is implemented, which leads me to our second point about how many of these recommendations have actually been seen through to the end.
So the question about the recommendations being seen through is one for the Met, and that the recommendations are made to the Metropolitan Police. And apologies if I wasn't clear about this. I was trying to answer your question about the sort of disproportionality and what that does in Section 60 by saying that through the Disproportionality Board, that is something we will look at, like what can it be explained, the level of disproportionality, or is it societal, professional, personal biases which are playing a part in the level of disproportionality? That is something which we are looking at, but it's not, as I would see it, part of this misconduct process. That's part of the way in which London is policed. What my sort of point about this is when the complaints are made and it gets into the process. I'm not talking about that sort of pre-stage where I accept your premise that there is disproportionality, and that's what our research would show, was simply that once in there, whether it's Section 60, whether it's a Section 23 Misuse of Drugs Act stop that has been complained about, there isn't a disproportionality of outcome at that stage. But I think your main point about Section 60 is something which we are proactively working with the Metropolitan Police, the Iopc and others to come up with what a commission to look at that issue is.
Well, only that so I'm responsible for professional standards and recognition. So my colleague DAC Jane Connors is the stop and search lead, but I do know that the IOPC thematic recommendations for stop and search, which are national. So London, Manchester, Birmingham, Dorset. You know, there's a very big difference across all of those. But all of those recommendations have very much been embraced by DAC Connors. I know she's written back with updates to the IOPC on how the Met has responded to those. So I'm afraid I don't know the detail because it's not sort of my area of expertise. But I think I can provide a degree of reassurance that we certainly have recognised, responded, and there is ongoing work to address the recommendations that aren't national ones for that, accepting that it's national stop and search, and will very often not be completely reflective of some of the diversity within London.
If I could tie two things together very quickly.
Very quickly, please. We're really running late now.
Okay, so if the IOPC were here, I would be asking them if they had yet produced the child key report, because obviously that is another situation that's arisen, and there's in the last few months it's subsequently been a report of a pseudonymous Olivia who's been searched in similar circumstances, and so I guess as an officer, I wonder what your views are on the fact that one good thing can be described as that is that it is now going to be much more difficult for that kind of search to take place. As far as I understand, on a young person, it would need to be at a high level of officer to authorise that. Then was the case that led up to those. But at the same time, we have a situation where the Home Office has recently reduced the level at which a stop and search can be authorised, and has so it's removed one power to reassure the public, replaced it with something else where the police can effectively act in exactly the same way. And I'm preempting more complaints of a different nature to the IOPC about police conduct. What can you do in standards to safeguard against those sorts of things happening in the future?
Well, again, my colleague DAC Taylor, Lawrence Taylor from Frontline Policing, is running an oversight group in relation to custody strip search and what we call MTIP, so the more intimate searches of children and young people. So I know that he is working on, and guidance has gone out about ensuring that the law is followed, and that all of the appropriate safeguards are in place for children and young people who find themselves interacting with police where there may be the need for a search for crime or their safety. And direction has gone out in relation to the authority levels for that. So I don't know the finer detail, but you know, from the IOPC will carry out their investigation. They may very well, I suspect, make recommendations, and hopefully that will be sooner rather than later, to help support DAC Taylor and that work group about anything else that we might want to consider.
Okay. Actually, I think that should have come under the next section, but anyway. Assembly Member Ahmed, you've asked to come in, but it must be very quick. We're really running very late. And short answers, gentlemen, if possible.
Actually, Chair, I very badly was signalling that I wanted to ask you a question, so you can stand down for a second. It was going back to regulations.
This isn't how it works.
Yeah. No, literally, I'm trying to be helpful.
Yeah.
Going back to the issue of regulation, which has come up before, I remember the Deputy Mayor talking about regulation standing in the way of doing certain issues. And you quite rightly identified, I think everyone in the committee would like things to move quicker. The Commander talked about, you know, an issue of if there was a rape by an officer, we'd like to see that officer removed from the force on the court steps. But it takes 3 to 4 weeks. I don't think there's any other profession that would happen. Can we assist in any way if the Met come up with, you know, this is what we need to do? Can we assist by writing to the Minister?
Yes, I think it has to go up to the next level. I had every intention of taking this offline because I know Kit Malthouse, and I'm very happy to assist wherever possible. I think we need to take it offline because I think it has to go in certain orders in order for it to go through to national. But thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right, so we're now moving on to our second section. If we could all be mindful of the time, because I promised the gentleman they'll be finished by 12-ish. And we're going to start with Assembly Member Garrett.
Hello. A couple of questions about body-worn video, actually, which obviously has great potential in this area, particularly where there are, you know, disagreements about what's gone on. So if I could ask you first, actually, Commander Savell, about the processes that police officers have for when they turn on their body-worn video. Are you happy that the guidance that officers have for when they use the body-worn video is correct, and that officers understand it and they're carrying it out correctly?
I think the guidance is very clear. And I think in 99.9% of the time it is followed. Sometimes I make a mistake, they forget to turn it on, but it's really clear around when it should be used, and we have tens of thousands a day of records, so I don't think there's any ambiguity in that, and the officers welcome it.
I know officers see it as a sort of protection for themselves, as well as obviously the public seeing it in the same way. I suppose my question was about whether it's being, because obviously the regulations require it, I think, to come, or not the regulations again, the advice to officers or the guidance to officers, the procedure to officers, if you like, is that it comes on, that they switch it on sort of before an engagement with the public. Is that right? I suppose my question really I'm getting at is it capturing, when you review body-worn footage, are you finding routinely that the early part of an interaction is captured?
Yes, you're completely correct. It should be turned on before they interact with someone, so that there's no ambiguity, or there's no indication that they've missed something, and it gives us the whole picture. So yeah, and my understanding and my experience is that is what officers do. You know, as they're getting out the car, they turn it on. So the first bit you see is the car door being opened and things like that. You know, that's what they do.
Good. Okay. I don't know. It may be a question for both of you, actually, about because the theoretical value of that footage in helping to clarify what's gone on isn't realised in practice if no one ever sees it. Obviously, officers internally see it. So this is the question about, you know, an incident occurs, not referring to any incident in particular for reasons that you talked about earlier, but an incident occurs, there's footage, let's say, on the internet about what has happened, which may have captured all of that interaction or part of it. What we hear sometimes in the committee here is that the police's view of the way that that incident has unfolded is not the same as was portrayed in the social media video, but the public has no way of knowing that because, or whether that's true or whether that's not true, because that video footage is never seen. So what are your thoughts on that part of it? Because obviously you could be reassured yourself that your officer's done a great job. We have no idea, we can't see, we just see what the public has seen, and the public doesn't see anything else.
Yes, it's a very good question, because on face value, it would be obvious as well. We'll just show you the body-worn video. However, I've discussed this with with colleagues about the decision making in relation to releasing a body-worn video, and actually, when you start to consider all the implications, it is far more complicated than one might consider to start off with. So, first of all, you should be getting the consent of those that are on the video to show it. There needs to be a legitimate, lawful policing purpose to release that body-worn video. In most cases, that is very difficult to justify. So if you have captured members of the public who are standing next to the person you're dealing with, that person needs to be contacted and asked for their consent. And you can immediately see some of the difficulties with that. The person that you're interacting with might actually not want that shown. That footage might actually end up being part of a judicial process or a misconduct process, and it being therefore widely known completely undermines the integrity of that and the potential for its use in a prosecution. But our view is it is not always a no. There may be instances where actually, despite there maybe not being a legitimate lawful policing purpose, it is in the interests of preventing serious disorder, for example, that actually we document our rationale as to why we will then release that body-worn video. It will not give you the circumstances of what the officers were told they were attending or dealing with before they switched their body-worn video on. It won't tell you what they saw as they were approaching, all those sorts of factors which will play in. So when you accumulate that all together, actually it starts to become quite difficult to be able to justify, and for actually what we would be in best intentions to display it actually ends up being detrimental or negative, or people then having a different interpretation. And I, as a member of the public, would think, well, why don't they just show us the body-worn video? When you start to take all those things into account, actually it provides a very limited picture in many cases.
Okay. Thank you. I don't know whether you had something to add on that.
So I've not got much to add to that. I would say, though, that it gets to a wider point, I think, that you're making, Assemblymember Garrett, there, which is actually, can the Metropolitan Police be a bit more front-footed in its comms when it's being criticised, or where there could be public reassurance around some things? And that is something which we in MOPAC have raised with the Metropolitan Police previously, because while they have to deal in fact and in evidence, and obviously that does constrain the fact that there may be judicial processes, I think there are ways in which they could be slightly more proactive at putting out messages which could either reassure the public or just correct a narrative if it's entirely wrong.
Yes, you're right. That was what I was getting at. Obviously, we touched a bit on that earlier with this question about whether officers can senior officers can comment on cases underway and the problems that arose with that. I suppose a specific example I had in mind, it's an American example, so it doesn't relate to anything here, but there was a person who actually had quite a senior role in the local equivalent of a committee like this, who was making allegations about police officers that they behaved inappropriately towards her, and the police video footage demonstrated that, in fact, she was how would I describe it, quite haughtily playing the "do you know who I am" card, and the police officers were very professional and very courteous, and I thought incredibly restrained, and the video footage that was released really vindicated their professional conduct towards her. And so, in some cases, you know, that would help. I see the problem though is if you sometimes can release it and sometimes you can't, you then just get allegations of, well, the police only release it when it vindicates them, and when they don't release it, they probably are hiding something, which I'm sure is what would be said. Anyway, sorry, I was going to, yes.
Sorry, I was just going to say that, I mean, that's a very good example, but one of the possible unintended consequences of that is that that person who's made those allegations then becomes subject to trolling and vitriol and harassment, and actually it massively backfires all over the place, and you have to take that into consideration as well. So it's a very complex picture for what might ordinarily think to be quite a simple, straightforward question and answer.
Yes, yes, you're sort of wading into the internet meme wars, aren't you? That's the danger. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. I'm the one that's been hounding the poor acting commissioner on this, because I feel very strongly about it. We can pixelate other people that are in it, and the whole point is so many of these videos are all over the internet, all over Twitter and Facebook, etc. And it's a case of sometimes I think the police should be protected of themselves more, to show that was an ideal case, to show that actually, and if that woman then got trolled, really, if she's making false claims, and I would say rightfully so, because if you're telling untruths in public, then you've got to, you know. Anyway, I've seen Assembly Member Boff very briefly here, because I've got others.
Where the police themselves have, I beg your pardon, sorry, we have seen situations where the police themselves have released videos in order to support their, to impress us that they're acting on inquiries and on raids and things like that. What's the difference in the protocols there?
Well, that will, you know, if they're releasing a video of carrying out a drugs raid, for example, is really demonstrating proactivity and providing some public reassurance that wouldn't be as a consequence of a complaint, and something that may be contentious, I suppose, would be my first thought around that.
So there's a different protocol that applies if there's a complaint and the general policing. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to pick up again on the body-worn video footage and the issue of sort of reassurance of the public, trust and confidence with the public. Now, I asked a mayor's question recently about how many MPS interactions captured by body-worn cameras have been reviewed by community monitoring groups, and how many of those were flagged for concern or negatively reviewed. And of the 334 stop and search encounters since September 2020, 90 of them were flagged for opportunities to improve. So that's about 1 in 4 being flagged for opportunities to improve by the community monitoring groups. And the sort of common themes that came up related to the use of handcuffs, the use of and compliance with Section 2 of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. So the Mayor's response said that work is underway with MOPAC to overhaul the community scrutiny mechanisms, increasing representation from communities most impacted by stop and search, and therefore improving accountability and transparency, and with the aim of increasing trust and confidence in the police. And I just wondered if either of you could comment more on that, just whether the sort of whether you think it's possible to improve on the outcomes of those community monitoring reviews, in that 1 in 4 flagging something of concern, you know, that's quite high, and just whether you think that perhaps the use of these community monitoring scrutiny groups might actually help kind of improve trust and confidence in the police, and also just help with the whole issue of police conduct.
So on the community monitoring groups, we absolutely think this is a way where we can improve trust and confidence. What has happened is obviously these were set up post the McPherson inquiry. They have been dealt with entirely independently and at arm's length from MOPAC, and that we have, and the police authority before that, and that we have no involvement really with them. What we are looking to do is to run a pilot where we help get the recruitment, we help provide sort of a bit more in the same way we do with the independent custody visitor scheme, where we provide a bit more support. So the arm, if you like, is much shorter, although they are still independent, with the idea being then that you would be able to take the chairs from them, take the learning and bring that up to a sort of pan-London level and actually start to look at things thematically rather than, and at BCU level, rather than just, at the moment they work in slightly different ways, each of them, and provide slightly different outputs and outcomes on them. And we think there is an opportunity here to really actually drive some benefit. They are also not universally the most representative of London, if I can be honest about it. And we think it would be much better to bring in sort of more diversity, but not just in terms of race and ethnicity, also in terms of age, because it does tend to be slightly older people who go there. And I'm probably slightly less likely to be stopped walking down the street than somebody in their late teens, early 20s, just candidly, as an example. So I think that is a way of doing it. Whether that will drive down the sort of 25% where areas for improvement will be identified, I don't know. I think it should help inform all the stuff in the same way that the community-led training, all of that work should improve. But I'll leave it to Commander Savell to talk about the sort of operational elements.
Just before Commander Savell comes in, you mentioned a pilot. Can you just give us some dates on that pilot?
So they're just being set up at the moment. We've established a sort of, how would you call it, a strategic expert reference group. We are just looking to get them up and underway probably within the next couple of months, I would say. One of the areas which is likely to be involved and where we're in discussions is Hackney, for obvious reasons around public trust and confidence more generally up in that space. And then there is a wider review of community scrutiny mechanisms overall, where we have just appointed a Black-led organisation to run for us, and where we'll be holding the first workshop at the public review meeting next week, and where I would encourage you to ask all of your voters and elected people to attend and help us help inform all of that work.
Thank you. It would be great to have details about that.
Just a little addition to that really is that the community monitoring groups, I think we all think are incredibly valuable, and they do get the opportunity to, as you say, to see the body-worn video in a controlled environment, and the lessons learnt are more around feeding back, as I understand it, into training around stop and search, conflict resolution, communication, negotiation, and those sorts of things, in order to reduce the impact that a stop search has on the member of the public, which is obviously important, and will help with then any subsequent levels of complaints around stop and search, because some of the reasons that people are stopped and searched is, incivility or unnecessary use of force, etc. So I do see that from a sort of complaints and Iopc perspective, there is a valuable role that has. It is very much about ensuring that communities know that there is an independent way of looking at what's going on, that voices are listened to, and that feedback and learning is put back into training. So officers do public and personal safety training at least twice a year. That is fed back into that, the learning from that about how to undertake a stop search safely, but with the right level of restraint and approach to members of the public.
Thank you, and I'm glad to hear that you see that the community monitoring groups have the potential for a valuable role. There are, in the 12 months to March 2022, there were over 200,000 stops and searches, which is, so if it's 1 in 4 of them, if you extrapolate across, if one in 4 of them has something to learn, that's sort of over 50,000 stops in a year, where there might be flags to improve, which is about 150 stops a day. So it's very powerful what could be done by making more of those community monitoring groups.
Yes, I accept the Chair, the request to be succinct, but I don't know what the criteria is for what goes to the community monitoring group, but it might be those that are more contentious, and therefore you couldn't extrapolate that out, if you see what you mean.
Thank you. Point well made.
Indeed, thank you. Assemblymember Pigeon.
Yes, my first question I covered actually earlier on data. I just want to ask the Commander about whether he considers that the Met fully cooperates with the IOPC when it's conducting investigations, because I know the Met was criticised, for example, by the Daniel Morgan independent panel, feeling that they weren't being cooperative. I've heard that from other bodies. Do you think you really fully cooperate with it, just within your team might, but across the Met where they need to?
Well, the liaison with the IOPC is, in almost all instances, is through my team.
Right.
So I have a team that are solely for liaison with the IOPC. They have good professional relationships, completely acknowledging and respecting the degree of independence, and all requests for information and everything else is logged through there, and they make sure that is provided. I have reasonably regular contact with the officers and staff in that team, and I would say that they feel, and clearly it would be a question for the IOPC, but they feel that they have very good, very productive working relationships with the IOPC. There will be occasions where there are hitches about disclosure of information, but they are, I think, the rarity. And at my level, just a sort of a broader answer, I have I think a good working relationship with Sal Nassim. If there is an issue, we will have phone conversations as a bit of a sort of early heads up to try and head things off, and that we have a mutually respectful but positive professional relationship.
Okay, lovely. We'll pick that also up with the IPC. Thank you.
Thank you. Assemblymember Desai.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, good morning to the panel. My question is to both of you, Commander and Mr. Bowie. What lessons have been learned from the Stephen Port murders? Reference has already been made to the case of Sir Everard and Child Q. And let me tell you why I ask you this question. We can talk about structures, internal processes, learning programs, who does what, all very important stuff, don't get me wrong. But to the public out there, their perception around trust and confidence issues in the police is framed by what they see around them, what they hear about them, what they see in terms of investigations like the one into the murders committed by Stephen Port. And we do know that of the 17 officers investigated, it was found that no officer had a case transfer of misconduct or gross misconduct, and that 9 officers' performance fell below the standard required. But then we also know that of these 9 officers, 5 have since been promoted, 3 to detective sergeant and 2 to detective inspector. The inquest finding at the end of 2021 was damning. I'm sure you're aware of the findings of the inquest. So whilst a view can be taken that the IOPC is a developing institution, and I think I still remember Pigeon earlier sort of used exactly those words, the reaction of people like Darren Rodwell, the leader of Buckingham Council, was very damning. He called the IOPC a body not fit for purpose. So, to ask both of you, what lessons have you learned from the investigations, the inquest findings, and what you now know?
I'll start, and thank you for the question. Again, I'm going to have to caveat my answer in relation to the IOPC are considering reopening the investigation, and as I understand it, they will be making that decision imminently. So they have recently, within the last couple of years, the changes to the regulations, had the power to go through a process to review to see if there is new information or something else which has come to light, which means that they should re-look at an investigation they've already concluded. And I know that they have publicly said that they are doing that. They are reviewing the evidence that was heard at the inquest against the evidence that they gathered in their investigation, and they're looking at it in the whole again. The decision will be made public, as I understand it, in the next week or two. So I can't stray too much into the Iopc investigation and so on. What I can tell you is that since the murders, there has been a lot of review of what went wrong internally. The Iopc have published their learning recommendations from that first investigation. I think there was either 16 or 18 recommendations, all of which we have accepted, all of which are either in place or being worked on. Her Majesty's Coroner produced a Prevention of Future Deaths report highlighting a number of issues that she felt there needed to be further learning on, which we have a statutory responsibility to respond to, which we have. A lot of it is either underway or being progressed now. Volumes of information available about all the different things that have happened to do our very best to make sure that it doesn't happen again and to improve our relations and contact with LGBT plus communities, and very strong links with our LGBT plus IAG, who have been very actively involved all the way through to point out where we have made errors, where we can improve, and are helping us do that. And I might steal Kenny's thunder now, but MOPAC have commissioned HMIC FRS to carry out an inspection into death investigation, which they are doing right now, and I was interviewed about yesterday morning.
Mr. Bowie, have you got anything to add to what the Commander has said?
No, he has covered a lot of the areas, I would say. I think your question about the IOPC being a failing organisation, I think that's obviously one you will need to put to the IOPC when they arrive. I was going to talk a lot about the IAGs and the links with the LGBT plus community. I was going to talk about, I can't remember the precise terminology, but investigative curiosity around unexplained deaths. I was also going to talk about the role of family liaison officers, where I think there was a bit of a failing in terms of how that had happened, and these are all the areas where we've actually, and the other thing which is part of the HMIC FRS investigation the Mayor has asked them to look at is the role of sort of leadership and supervision of these investigations, so that it's not just on the initial how do you, those links between the different deaths, unexplained deaths in the situation, get joined up, which is what should have happened.
Thank you. Commander, I'll just say that the sisters of Jack Taylor, the last victim of Stephen Port, have written to the chair, and I've indeed met them. They're also constituents of mine living in Barking, so I shall convey what you just said, especially the IOPC will let us imminently know as to how they're going to sort of take things forward. So I'm sure they'll be pleased to hear that. Thank you.
Yes, I understand the IOPC are in contact with all of the families and loved ones from the victims, so I'm hoping that they will know that.
I'll reinforce that message.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure we'll come back to those particular sets of murders. Okay, now we're going over to Assembly Member Sahota.
Thank you, Commander. We've spoken about the public's perception, but what's the perception of the rank-and-file police officers about the IOPC? What do they think about that?
Well, I would have to generalise, obviously,
of course.
but I think they probably have a low opinion of the IOPC, to be honest. We strive, the regulations strive, the IOPC strive to promote learning and to not make mistakes and to improve and deliver a better service. You know, we have a monopoly on the service that we provide. We should be providing the very best service we possibly can. People will make mistakes. If people are fearful of coming forward and making mistakes, coming forward and explaining that they've done something wrong or whatever else, that is completely contrary to what we want to achieve. I think that they see the IOPC as an independent body that's out to get them. I won't mince my words, but I think you could probably understand why they feel that. That's not what they want to do, and it's not the message that my department promote. Now, they are independent, they serve a role, and in some instances they find no case to answer, and they do support what the officers have said. I have seen occasionally reports back from the Iopc commending what the officer did when there was a death or a serious injury, and actually we had to refer it, and they commend what happened. But generally, I think they have a fairly dim view of the Iopc.
And this dim view, does it influence the way they interact with the IPC when the inquiries are going on then?
Well, there are rules and procedures in relation to their compliance with requests to be interviewed and so on and so forth. The Federation will almost inevitably be supporting any officer, or the Superintendents Association if they're a senior officer, will support an officer if they're going to be investigated by the IOPC, and where necessary provide legal advice if it's serious enough. So there's a very strict procedure which they will follow the advice in relation to what they should say and shouldn't say and how they say it, but they will have to give an account. Sometimes that's not in an interview. They will take the questions away and provide a written account, but I think it's a misnomer that, like members of the public may see on the TV, where you've got a suspect in an interview just sitting there going, no comment, no comment, no comment, and never says anything. Actually, the officer might say that, but the officer will then take the questions the IOPC want, go away and give a full but considered response. So there is a big difference.
And in your opinion, have you seen any meaningful improvements in the police complaints and conduct system since the foundation of the IPC? I mean, the question is, what happened before IPC and since then? Has there been any improvement?
Well, I have to say that I haven't been working in this area prior to the IOPC, so I can only just sort of generally reflect policing view and sort of public view. I think the IOPC have improved considerably. And I think the strategic objectives of the IOPC under Michael Lockwood are the right ones. So they have got a lot better, is my view. There are lots of things that we've discussed today and questions I'm sure you'll have for them about how they can improve, but I think it's a positive trajectory.
Thank you, Commander. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, and that's good to hear. Assembly Member Ahmed.
Thank you, Chair. Commander, in your opinion, have you seen meaningful improvements in the police complaints and conduct system since the foundation of the IOPC?
I think my answer to that really is that it's more to do with the regulations than it is to the IOPC. So we all have to follow the statutory regulations, and as much as probably the IOPC are as frustrated as we are about some of them sometimes, I think they have invested more in training. I know they are doing their best in relation to their capacity and capability. There is more to do, but I think we are all constrained by what the regulations say and do, and how we have to comply with those.
Thank you. How have you evaluated the Met's progress on implementing the IOPC recommendations in its 2020 Stop and Search report?
I'm afraid I would have to defer to DAC Connors. So she is the thematic lead for Stop and Search. She has been the one responsible for all of those recommendations, because they are all about how we carry out Stop and Search. And whilst it's come from the IOPC and I know I'm the professional standards lead, it relates to a different bit of business, so I'm afraid I can't really answer that question.
So could we have a written response, do you think, at some point?
I'm sure, yes, with our response to the IOPC recommendations and Commander Connors can provide an update to that. Yes, that's fine.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bowie, how do you work with the IOPC on following up on recommendations and learning actions?
So as I said, we generally have quite a few mechanisms, whether at officer level or at deputy mayor or mayoral level, and from time to time on those agendas we will discuss the learning reports and the responses to all of that. Equally, when we meet with the Iopc, and we are discussing what are the thematic issues which come out. Again, on occasion, we'll touch upon all of those issues.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll leave it there, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Pigeon.
I just wonder whether, Commander, you could put in your response to us whether what progress the Met's making in implementing recommendations from the IOPC's report around Operation Houghton, which focused on Charing Cross Police Station, and also on the 17 recommendations which went to all UK police forces in August 2021 around taser use. Whether we could have an update on those, please.
Absolutely. So, taser use, I'd give the same response about stop and search and provide the information. I know a lot more about Op Houghton. So there were a number of recommendations which we received in beginning of January. We responded within the time frame, accepting all of those recommendations. My governance looks at all of those, how they are progressing, who has responsibility for them, and there is continual oversight that I run on a quarterly basis to make sure that everything that was covered in there that we've accepted, and rightly so, is being progressed and embedded. So there is good governance and oversight on that, and that's through my professional standards team. Sure. Yeah.
Thank you. And the last question from Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. I have two questions. The first formal question I think has already been answered, but for the sake of completeness, I'll still put it to you, Mr. Bowie. So in terms of the role of the police complaint system and its importance within the wider role of the Mayor to improve trust and confidence in policing in London, particularly amongst groups for whom trust is lowest, is there anything further you wish to add? I mean, you've given us some very comprehensive answers. So.
No, I mean, I would just refer back to what I've said and say that we think that the IOPC plays a very important role in trust and confidence, that we have a good relationship with them, and we use their learning and system to feed into our scrutiny of the Met.
Okay, and to you, Commander, in the last PCC meeting, the Acting Commissioner confirmed that Operation Hillman, or the Met's investigation into breaching of COVID rules at Downing Street, had been referred to the IOPC. Do you know if an investigation has officially been launched?
I think we've had complaints about Operation Hillman and the decision making. I'm not aware that the Operation Hillman investigation has been referred to the IOPC. So I think there's some clarity around that. So I think there has been complaints from other MPs about it.
One MP, yeah.
Yes. But I don't think that the actual investigation has been referred to the IOPC. It's complaints have been made about it, which are being responded to now.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
Assembly Member Mo, but really, really quickly, we are at time.
The information that Assembly Member Pigeon asked for, could we have that broken down by BCU as well, please?
If we're able to do that, absolutely.
Lovely. Thank you, colleagues. Right, I'd like to thank our guests for attending today and for their answers to our questions. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion?
Noted.
Thank you. Can we also delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting?
Agreed.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note its work programme for the 22-23 Assembly year?
Noted.
Thank you. The next meeting of the committee will be held on Wednesday, 22nd of June at 10 a.m. in the Chamber, City Hall. I have no other urgent business, so that concludes today's meeting. Thank you, everybody.